before the first nail was ever forged, before architecture had blueprints or building codes. There were people, poor, landless, overlooked, who looked at a patch of dirt and decided it could become home. They didn't have power tools. They didn't even own the land they lived on. What they had was will. What they built was shelter out of nothing. Just branches, mud, fire, and the unshakable belief that surviving one more winter with your family was worth every splinter, every blister, every back-breaking step. This isn't a fairy tale. It's the brutal, brilliant truth about how peasants in the Middle Ages built homes that still stand centuries later, and why, even now, they have more to teach us about resilience, community, and the meaning of enough than we might ever learn from steel and glass. In a world where your survival depended not on income, not on status, but on whether you could drag a tree trunk through the mud before winter, the medieval peasant stood with bare hands against the raw will of nature. No contractors, no blueprint, no backup plan. Imagine waking up every morning to a house you built yourself, timber by timber, dung by dung, knowing that if one wall crumbled, the walls weren't far behind. This wasn't some rustic fantasy. This was cold, hard survival wrapped in smoke, soot, and the sound of children sleeping beside chickens. You see, we talk about resilience in modern life, but we don't really understand it, not the way a peasant with a splintered axe and a muddy floor did. This is the story of how ordinary people with no wealth, no machines, and barely a claim to their land built homes that defied centuries. And if you think you know what DIY means, think again. Because what you're about to see isn't just architecture, it's resistance carved into every beam. It's what humanity looks like when stripped to its bones and still refuses to fall. So here's the problem: nobody romanticizes. In medieval Europe, peasants didn't own the land they lived on, not even close. About 95% of it belonged to lords or the church. So every dream of shelter started with a negotiation or a gamble. Want to build a home? You either asked permission or hoped no one in a cloak and crown noticed you clearing brush. And that gamble, it came with fines, or eviction, or worse. Imagine raising 4 walls with your bare hands, only to have someone ride up and declare, "It not yours." That was the default state of existence. Build in fear, build in the shadows. Still, peasants found a kind of guerrilla wisdom in where they built. They didn't browse neighborhoods, they scanned tree lines. Forest edges gave them timber and firewood. A stream meant water for cooking, drinking, and that one annual bath if they were lucky. Every decision had to be survival first. Will this ground flood? Is there enough wood within dragging distance? Will the insects carry off? My child, in the night, even some of the more daring resorted to assaulting, illegally clearing forest to farm and build, knowing full well they could be fined or driven off. But sometimes, improving a lord's unused land earned a begrudging nod of approval and a lifelong debt of taxes. Entire villages, over generations, would gradually shift their footprints, moving inch by inch toward better water, better trees, less swamp. These weren't planned communities. They were evolving organisms, shaped by necessity. And every new site was a wager. Bet your family's future on a patch of earth. Hope the rains don't wash it away. Let's talk tools. Or, more accurately, the lack of them. In the modern world, DIY comes with aisles of options. Laser levels, pre-cut beams, YouTube tutorials narrated by friendly bearded men. For the medieval peasant, 1 axe, maybe. And if that axe had a cracked handle or a dull blade, tough luck. That was your inheritance, your hammer, your saw, your lifeline. The forests were your home depot, but getting materials wasn't just about strength, it was about strategy. First obstacle, permission. Forest laws were strict. Dead wood you could gather, sure, but cut down a live tree without your lord's blessing, you might end up missing a hand. Not metaphorically, literally, but let's say you did have permission, or courage. Now you had to get the wood, without wagons, without roads, really, just sloshy, ankle-deep mud paths that turned into soup when it rained. Logs didn't roll themselves, they were dragged, through muck, by hand. Sometimes, if you were lucky, with the help of a neighbor or a few oxen that weren't already claimed. And don't even dream of carrying beams from 10 miles away. Realistically, if you couldn't walk it there in a day, it didn't exist. Different wood had different jobs. Oak for strength's main posts that held the whole frame together, many of which still stand 500 years later. Hazel and willow for weaving the bendy skeleton of your walls. You cut in winter when sap was low, then waited months for it to season. If it was green, it might bend better, but it would crack later. If it was dry, it was strong, but damn near unworkable. Every choice had consequences. The result, a pile of logs that looked like a campfire gone wild, but to a peasant family, it was hope. Hard-earned, back-breaking. Hope. Now you've got the wood, the spot, and a few calluses that will never heal. It's time to raise your house, literally. But if you think framing a medieval home was just for posts and a roof, you're missing the marvel of what came next. The timber frame wasn't just structure, it was the skeleton, the spine, the engineering genius of 1,000 years of trial and error, all executed without metal nails, power drills, or scaffolding. Digging came first, not with excavators, but with wooden shovels and iron spades passed down like family heirlooms. Each hole for the vertical posts had to go 2 feet deep, sometimes more. Many peasants placed large stones at the base for drainage to keep the wood from rotting, not because they understood hydrodynamics, but because they watched what worked. Then came the frame raising, and this is where community mattered more than muscle. A 20-foot oak beam doesn't politely stand up by itself. It takes 6, maybe 10, people coordinating every lift, every brace, every breath. Try showing off and lifting alone. You'd become medieval flapjack, and no one would remember your name. Joints were the real magic. Without nails, builders relied on mortise and tenon joinery wood slots, cut with crude chisels and paired with perfect tongues. Pegs, called tree nails, secured the whole thing. When rain hit, they swelled, locking joints tighter. These frames didn't just stand up, they locked together like bone in socket. Many are still standing centuries later, stubborn against wind, rot, and time. The raising of the roof beams was the climax, dangerous, communal, ceremonial. Everyone showed up, even neighbors you hadn't seen since harvest, because unwritten rules governed the village. Help your neighbor build, or no one helps you. And everyone knew sooner or later your own roof would fall. Now here's where it gets real and messy. You've raised the frame, but right now your house is a skeleton. Wind blows straight through it, rain laughs at your roofless effort, and your kids are still sleeping beside a mud pile. Enter the medieval miracle called wattle and daub. Think of it as insulation, structure, and compromise rolled into one. No plaster, no drywall, no prefab panels. Just woven sticks, sticky gunk, and a whole lot of stomping. First came the wattle, bendy branches of hazel, willow, or ash woven. between upright timbers in a crisscross pattern that looked more like basket art than construction. This lattice created a flexible frame to catch the doorband. That's where things got primal. Door was made of clay, sand, chopped straw, and manure. Yes, poop, cow poop, horse poop, whatever you could scoop. Why? Because animal dung had enzymes that helped the mixture bind. In a strange twist of chemistry meets necessity, crap was your glue. Families would gather in pits, barefoot, stomping the daub into a sticky sludge, kids giggling like it was a medieval bounce house. No gloves, no mask, just mud and microbes. Then came the application. Handfuls of muck were slapped onto the wattle from both sides, pushed through until the gaps disappeared. Over time, it dried into a solid, insulating wall, and if you could afford it, you painted over it with lime. Whitewasher, bright antiseptic layer that protected the surface and reflected light inside your one-room palace. Archaeological finds have proven it. Some of these daubed walls lasted hundreds of years. Dirt and dung turned into durability. And when you realize that these walls, coated in filth, kept out the cold and held in warmth, you stop judging the stink. You start respecting the science. You've got walls now solid enough to keep out wind and the occasional suspicious neighbor, but look up. Without a roof, your whole effort is still one good storm away from collapse. So now comes the final shield, the medieval miracle that was part science, part art, and entirely flammable: thatch. Thatched roofs weren't rustic charm, they were the only option. Tiles were for castles. Wood shingles cost too much and weighed too much. So peasants turned to what was around them: straw, reeds, marsh grasses, cheap, light, surprisingly effective, and yes, a little terrifying. First, you gathered your bundles, lots of them. A small cottage might need thousands. Wheat straw worked well if you had fields, but reeds from wetlands lasted longer, sometimes up to 60 years. Then came the thatcher, the only real pro in this whole process. Thatching was a skill, an art form even, and some peasants specialized in it. You layered the bundles from bottom to top, securing each with wooden rods called sways, bent over the thatch and tied down. The roof pitch, crucial, too flat, and water soaked in, too steep, and the builder slid off to meet medieval gravity head first. Most roofs angled at 45 to 60 degrees, perfect for runoff, challenging for balance. Once complete, thatch was remarkably insulating, warm in winter, cool in summer, but also a tinderbox. One errant ember from the hearth below, and your home could vanish in minutes. In fact, entire villages burned to ash more than once. Eventually, some towns outlawed thatch altogether, but for centuries, it was the norm. And not just for warm. It was home to birds, mice, insects, sometimes snakes. You didn't need an alarm clock. You had the 5 a.m. chirp of your rooftop roommates. Still, thatch was renewable, local, and recycled when removed turned into mulch or bedding. It was messy, fragile, and brilliant, just like the people who lived beneath it. So, your house is up, it's standing, it's dryish, it's warm sometimes. Now comes the real question. What's it like to actually live inside it? Forget hardwood, tile, or even cobblestone. The average medieval peasant floor was dirt. Not symbolic down to earth, literal packed earth, the same as outside. You walked in and just kept walking. To improve it, peasants would mix in straw, crushed shell, sand, or lime. Sometimes they'd even toss in herbs like meadowsweet to mask the damp stench. Over time, thousands of footsteps packed that floor hard enough to bounce a pebble. Sometimes they sloped it slightly so liquids, don't ask, could drain toward a corner. But there were no drains, no toilets, no bathroom tiles, just the corner, the walls, maybe lime-washed if you had the coin. More likely, still smelling faintly of manure and clay, now turned a smoky brown from months of open-fire living. Furnishings sparse. Tables were planks on trestles. Benches doubled as beds. Storage, whatever you could hang from a peg or hide in a basket. And speaking of beds, don't get too comfortable. The entire family slept in one room, one space. One big, smelly, snoring collective of parents, kids, grandparents, and, in winter, chickens, goats, maybe a calf if it was a harsh January. The animals weren't pets, they were heaters and privacy. It didn't exist. The concept of go to your room didn't apply when there was no other room. If you had a raised platform to sleep on, you were lucky. If it was covered in straw, you were rich. These homes were noisy, smoky, crowded, and yet they worked. Families cooked, laughed, told stories, spun wool, carved wood, and raised children. Within those walls, they worked with what they had. And somehow, they built not just homes, but lives that endured. At the heart of every peasant home wasn't furniture or decor. It was fire. The hearth was the center of life. Heat, light, cooking, companionship, it all circled that open flame. But this wasn't a neatly bricked fireplace with a chimney and a mantel. Most early medieval homes didn't have chimneys at all. Instead, smoke simply found its own way out through a hole in the roof called a louver, or through tiny vents in the walls, or by drifting through the thatch itself. Basically, your entire house was the chimney. You breathed it, you wore it, you coughed it up. Over time, ceiling beams blackened, walls darkened. Children grew up thinking stinging eyes were normal. Visitors, if they came often, commented on the haze, the smell, the constant burning in their lungs. But peasants adapted. The hearth was usually just a shallow pit in the center of the dirt floor, lined with clay or stone. More advanced homes might raise it a bit to reduce fire risk, but risk never disappeared. Fuel came from whatever could burn: dried wood, straw, peat, even dung or seaweed in coastal regions. Just gathering enough for winter could eat up entire. Day's cooking was primitive. Pots hung over the fire, sometimes on tripods. Bread baked in clay pots, buried in hot ash. There was no oven, there was no off switch. Just a live flame and instincts honed over years. And while fire kept the family alive, it could also wipe out everything. Thatched roofs, wooden beams, open flames, villages burned down regularly. Whole settlements erased in a night. Still, the hearth remained. It was the original stove, the original light bulb, the original living room. And even when it smoked up the house, even when it threatened to kill you in your sleep, was family. It was life. Let's kill the fantasy once and for all. Medieval peasant homes were never done. They weren't a finished project, they were a living, crumbling thing. Maintenance wasn't seasonal, it was constant. Ceilings sagged, walls cracked, floors shifted. If you weren't fixing something, you were preparing to. And if you waited too long, the house reminded you loudly. Start with thatch. It wasn't permanent. Birds ripped it apart to build nests. Rats tunneled into it. Storms blew it off in sheets. One winter gale, and suddenly you were staring at stars through your ceiling. So you patched, layered, replaced, and then replaced again. Next up, the walls. Wattle and daub might sound rustic and charming, but dry weather made it crack. Wet seasons turned it to sludge. Peasants learned to read their walls like doctors read skin when the whitewash turned brown. It meant the daub was failing, water was creeping in, and you had hours not days to fix it before the structure beneath began to rot. You didn't grab a toolbox, you grabbed Grandpa, because odds were he remembered how it was fixed last time. Repairs used whatever was on hand: a bone knife to trim thatch, a wooden float to smear daub, a mallet that had patched a dozen walls in a dozen winters. There were no contractors. You were the contractor. And if your repairs failed, you paid the price. Not in aesthetics, in frostbite, in illness, in collapse. Even the floor fought. Back, water pooled, mud returned, herbs wilted. You had to pack in more clay, more straw. Sometimes you just accepted that your house would sag a little until spring. And when spring came, roof patching. When fall came, redobbing. When winter came, survival. And all of it, every last bit, was part of the rhythm. There was no escaping it. Home ownership was a 24/7 full-body contract with nature, and nature had no mercy clause. Now imagine trying to live your entire life in a single room the size of a modern studio apartment. Electricity, privacy, or peace. That was daily life for the medieval peasant family. Not just sleeping, but cooking, eating, working, giving birth, dying, mourning, laughing, grieving, all in the same 15 by 20-foot space. No walls to separate activities, no corners to hide in, no doors to close when emotions got high. You didn't wake up and go to work. You woke up in work. The loom was beside your bed. The chickens were under the table. Your kids' lice were probably your lice, and the air, a swirling blend of smoke, sweat, manure, boiled turnips, and damp wool. This wasn't romantic homesteading. It was a pressure cooker for family dynamics. Arguments didn't simmer, they exploded. But so did laughter, storytelling, music. And somehow, despite the claustrophobia, people raised children, cared for elders, nursed the sick, and built traditions strong enough to survive generations. The home doubled as a barn in winter. Livestock were brought inside to prevent freezing. So now, add goat hooves clicking across the floor at 3 a.m. to your sensory nightmare: windows. If you were lucky, a small shuttered opening covered with oiled cloth or animal bladder. Glass was a luxury. Light came from the open door or the fire end. When both were out, you slept. Furniture was less about comfort, more about utility. A bench to sit on during the day became your bed at night. Tables were collapsible. You didn't own a chair. You were the chair. Tools and belongings hung from rafters, because the floor was for people and beasts. And still this space, this chaotic, overcrowded micro-world, worked. It adapted. It evolved. It was flexible, layered, communal. It reflected a worldview where survival wasn't individual, it was collective. You didn't just share space, you shared life. Everyday life in a medieval peasant home followed rhythms as ancient as the firelight that lit the walls. There was no morning alarm, just the light of dawn seeping through an unshuttered door, the rustling of animals, and the grumble of an empty stomach. The day began early because light was limited and every minute of daylight mattered. Water had to be fetched from the stream or well before breakfast if there was breakfast. Food was simple, repetitive, seasonal: porridge, dark bread, boiled greens. If you were lucky, maybe cheese. If you were really lucky, meat usually saved for feast days or bribes to the Lord. Utensils were minimal. Wooden bowls, a family trencher, made of stale bread, and knives, personal knives, that traveled with you everywhere. Forks, a noble luxury. You used your fingers, and then wiped them on your tunic or apron, if at all. The fire at the center wasn't just for warmth, it was the kitchen, the stove, the dishwasher, the source of clean water and cooked meals. Cauldrons hung on tripods, swinging slightly over flames. Bread baked inside earthen pots or clay ovens, if you had one, often just buried in hot coals and ash. And through it all, smoke curled up and lingered. It stained the walls. It coated the lungs. It stung the eyes. But it also softened the food, warmed the bones, and filled the air with something resembling comfort. Evenings were brief but sacred. As the fire flickered low, families gathered to share not just meals, but moments, songs, tales, proverbs passed down like gold. There was no Netflix, no silence. Grandpa told stories, Grandma mended linen, children spun wool or carved small toys, and the day wound down inside that one glowing room. Sleep came early, not out of leisure, but out of exhaustion. Everyone collapsed where they could, on straw, on benches, on each other, and tomorrow it would begin again, at the exact same hearth, with the exact same flame. Winter changed everything. In summer, the house breathed a little. Doors stayed open, work moved outside, people stretched their limbs. But when the cold came, when frost crept into the floor and wind rattled, the house became a bunker. Not a cozy retreat, but a tight, claustrophobic shell where every breath hung heavy in the smoky air. Livestock moved in, chickens under the table, goats near the fire, a calf by the sleeping platform. Their warmth was not a convenience, was survival. Their smells became part of the air you breathed. Their movements were background noise to your dreams. Every creak of timber felt louder, every cough echoed, and the hearth had to stay alive always. Letting the fire die meant relighting it from scratch, often with wet wood or soggy peat. So someone always fed it, even in the middle of the night. Fuel stockpiles painstakingly gathered through autumn dwindled quickly. You measured days in bundles of straw. You rationed not food, but warmth. The roof groaned under snow. Walls grew damp. Sometimes daub crumbled in corners, and desperate fingers patched it with whatever was nearby: more dung, old cloth, scraps of last year's straw. Even sickness changed in winter. No ventilation meant illnesses spread fast. Coughs became bronchitis. Minor chills became death sentences. The family huddled close, wrapped in shared blankets, curled like spoons in the dark. But still, through this, people sang. They told stories. They sharpened tools. They mended clothes. They taught their children how to read a fire, how to watch a roofline, how to tell if the daub was too dry or too wet. These were not just survival skills. They were architectural inheritance. In winter, the home was a fortress under siege, and the weapon was knowledge passed from calloused hand to small hand, across generations who refused to give in. Every medieval house had a lifespan not measured in bricks or years, but in repairs. You didn't build a home and walk away. You nursed it, fought with it, argued with the weather through its walls, and sometimes you lost, no matter how tightly. Daubed, no matter how well thatched, every house decayed. Mud walls cracked, thatch thinned, floors dipped and warped. There was no pause button. A peasant home demanded constant upkeep, because the moment you stopped, nature took back what it loaned. Some houses simply slumped into the earth. Others were torn down and rebuilt on the exact same footprint. Not because of sentiment, but because that was the only land they had. The village didn't expand, it recycled. Same stones, same beams if they could be salvaged. New daub, same fire pit. Rebuilding wasn't failure, was rhythm. Archaeological. Digs show the layers like rings in a tree. One generation's walls buried beneath another's floor. Each home a palimpsest of lives lived, roofs patched, children born, goats delivered by firelight. It was a kind of living resurrection. Nothing was ever static. Even the tools for repair were passed down. A wooden float worn smooth by a grandfather's palm. A mallet with notches from 3 generations of thatchers. And the knowledge that was the mortar. You didn't just learn how to fix a crack. You learned how to see it coming when the wall whispered weakness, when the draft meant trouble. The homes had no voice, but they spoke. And those who listened survived. Those who didn't, rebuilt again. Strip away the mud, the manure, the biting winters and the splintered beams, and what's left? A house. No, what's left is a feeling, a rhythm, a bond. These homes, for all their fragility, weren't just physical shelters. They were emotional. Ecosystems. The walls were thin, yes, but so were the barriers between people. You didn't just live near your family, you absorbed them. Their moods, their habits, their heartbreak, their humor. In that tiny space, everything was shared. Warmth, illness, silence, stories, chores, and grief. There were no secrets. There wasn't even the space to pretend. You couldn't escape your mother's sigh, your brother's cough, or the tremor in your father's hand after a day of dragging logs. You felt each other because you had no choice but to feel. And in that intimacy, something powerful emerged. Resilience, not the kind sold on motivational posters, but the kind grown from proximity, necessity, and repetition. These homes, smoky and crumbling, birthed rituals. The morning lighting of the fire, the careful layering of thatch each fall, the annual mud-stomping daub day that doubled as a village gathering. Children didn't just inherit tools, they inherited ways of being. When to listen, when to speak, how to patch, when to pull down, how to mourn the sound of a wall collapsing and still get up the next day to rebuild it. This wasn't architecture. It was memory with a roof. And while not a single medieval peasant left behind a blueprint with their name on it, they left something better. Homes that felt human, imperfect, loud, alive. We may not live in one-room huts anymore, but we still long for connection, still crave warmth, still gather around fire even if it now glows from screens. Maybe the lesson isn't in the timber or the daub. Maybe it's in the courage to build a life every day from scratch with what little you have and to do it together. What medieval peasants built wasn't just shelter, it was proof that humanity thrives not through abundance, but through resilience. These one-room, smoke-stained homes, patched with mud and held together by sticks and stubbornness, tell us something our modern world often forgets. That warmth doesn't come from central heating, but from closeness. That safety isn't guaranteed by stone walls, but by people who refuse to let each other fall. That legacy isn't a house that lasts 500 years. It's a skill passed from father to daughter, a memory pressed into a worn tool handle, a fire kept alive through the longest night. In their dirt floors and thatched ceilings lies a blueprint for something we still chase today: connection, purpose, endurance. And in a world that constantly tries to sell us more, the medieval peasant reminds us that sometimes enough is simply for strong posts, one glowing hearth, and a roof that doesn't leak, at least not tonight.